Hello, it is Lane. I just woke up and I look like shit, but I wanted to make a video because I have to leave for work in a couple hours and I don't have a lot of sunlight left to do that with, because I have a job now, so what's up with that? That's awesome. I mean, it's okay, but it's a job. Anyway, I wanted to talk about a couple topics that I've been kind of like putting off talking about. I just kind of did a coin toss today that this was the topic that I was going to talk about, and that's that I want to make another video talking kind of about intersex stuff and trans stuff and the intersections between those two identities, because basically ever since I came out as intersex like last year, I think, and I've been kind of coming to terms with unpacking that identity and how that applies to my life experience and relationship to queerness and gender identity and trauma stuff and all this stuff that I've been unpacking and kind of talking about a bit, that like there's really not a lot of understanding of like intersex people or issues within the trans community, which I find very surprising given the amount of overlap in political interests and like modus, like the ways in which intersex people and trans people face similar oppressions at similar institutions and stuff. Like you'd figure there'd be a bit more like intercommunity stuff going on there, but there really isn't, and I feel like it's for a number of different reasons. I feel like for some reason, like it's both, like I feel like there's a lot of dyadism or like intersexism in the trans community, and there's also somewhat like some like transphobia in like the larger intersex community, that could potentially cause an issue, although like the part of the intersex community that I exist in is only the trans intersex community, so I don't really know any cis intersex people, but yeah, I feel like there's a lot of kind of like intersexism and dyadism in the trans community that tries to kind of like distance itself from intersexuality, in like the cultural understanding of it, like that they almost don't want to be like associated with intersex people, in some ways, like things like people joking about how when they talk about being non-binary, people ask, you know, if they have a penis and a vagina or something, but it's kind of worded in a way that like, oh, that's so disgusting, can you believe that person would have asked that, you know what I mean? It's kind of like, I feel like oftentimes when people are trying to like get forward their own like civil rights, if that's the proper word, like issue, they kind of tend to do so by like positioning themselves as being more amicable than another group, if that makes sense. And I feel like also like another part of it is that like some parts of the trans community, especially like within the non-binary community, feel like having an intersex identity would almost like inherently validate their identity as a non-binary person, or as a trans person, and are kind of like struggling to dissociate transness from intersexuality because they want to be seen as just as valid, even though they don't have some like biological reason to back it up, even though that's not how it works at all, you know what I mean? But that can be the cultural perception sometimes, that that intersexuality almost like validates like transness or non-binariness, which it very much doesn't in my experience. Like people will always find, like if people are intent on pigeonholing you, then they're always going to find some sort of method to pigeonhole you, even if like definitely me talking about being intersex on the internet has not stopped the amount of messages that I get from people telling me that I'm really a girl or I'm really a boy or whatever they are perceiving me as. So like if people are intent on being transphobic and are intent on invalidating your identity, they're not going to stop and be like, oh, whoa, wait, I didn't know you were intersex. That makes a difference, because it definitely doesn't. So yeah, there's almost that perception, among non-binary people specifically, and like I feel like, I don't know, I also feel like allies tend to kind of like have a hard time grappling with intersex stuff because they feel like any like mention of it, like they're so afraid of saying the wrong thing, or like they feel like any mention of it or any, you know, conflation between intersex issues and trans issues is like gonna like make them problematic or something. Or like I've heard some people say that like you shouldn't associate intersex issues with non-binary issues because that like invalidates the gender identities of like cis and binary trans intersex people, which like no, like intersex issues and non-binary issues are linked for different reasons. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's invalidating of anyone's identity. At least that's my opinion as one individual intersex person. So yeah, I guess I just kind of wanted to talk about like some intersectionality stuff between like my experience as a non-binary person, as a trans person, as an intersex person, and you know, I guess like my difficulty like parsing out those identities, because I feel like as like an intersex person and a non-binary person, there's a lot of pressure to kind of hold those identities as being very separate things, you know what I mean? And or like just being intersex and trans in general, because like you worry about that, what that says about other trans people, or about like your understanding or relationship to gender identity and sex and stuff. Like, but the thing is that like people don't lead single issue life. Like no one is like living a single identity life. Like no one has like a single issue life. And so I feel like while like me being intersex is not necessarily like causal, like doesn't have a causal relationship to me identifying as non-binary, I definitely feel like my experience, like my lived experience as a non-binary person, is very much informed and related to my experience as an intersex person, if that makes sense. Like it's not like one caused the other or one like validates the other, but it's just like they're not experiences that I can be like, this is an intersex experience and this is a non-binary experience, and I can like neatly put them into like separate piles, you know what I mean? Because no one has an issue like that. Like the way, if you experience anything, if you experience like disability or racialization or like neurodivergence or psychiatrization or like classism or like any like identity, like that is also going, like any form of marginalization is also going to inform how you experience other forms of marginalization, and also how you experience other forms of privilege. Like it's all very like nebulous and like tied into each other. And so I guess like I feel weird that I feel like there's so much desire to dissociate from intersexuality, like in the trans community and in the non-binary community, that like it's like non-binary intersex people are very much expected to like separate those identities and separate those like experiences, and I feel like that's not really helpful for anyone. And also like I feel like the trans community and the non-binary community don't really like understand how much contribution has come from like non-binary intersex people, specifically like intersex people within that community, and how much work that they've done like historically, and when it comes to like activism and stuff. Like I've seen a few non-binary people kind of be like, oh, like don't make this sex marker debate that's coming up now, like should we get neutral sex markers or should we eliminate sex markers altogether? And they were saying like, oh, don't make this about intersex people, like don't make this an intersex issue because like it's a non-binary issue. And it's just like that the sex marker issue is very much simultaneously an intersex issue and a non-binary issue, and especially when it comes to intersex things and non-binary things, like in general, those two identities have a lot of mutual ground when it comes to priorities in rights movements and in like what they're kind of like working towards insofar as like freedom and stuff like that. And so like it really bugs me when I see like non-binary people be like, oh no, this isn't an intersex issue, like don't like bring that over here kind of thing, like we're doing our own thing. And it's just like, so like the whole sex marker thing and like gender neutral pronouns and like so much non-binary stuff that happened before the larger like non-binary movement thing that's kind of happening now, but that has only really started within the past like 5 years, I would say, so that it's, or like even like 3 years that it's come into visibility. But before that, like all that work was being done by intersex people mostly, and so much progress that's been made in the trans community and in the non-binary community has come from intersex activism, that I feel like the trans community really needs to be better informed about the interactions between intersex issues and non-binary issues and trans issues, and how we can kind of help each other and help ourselves moving forward with that, rather than trying to like separate out all of our identities very neatly, you know. And because the thing is that like things like SRS and things like allowing, I don't want to say allowing, but technically from an institutional standpoint, allowing trans people to socially and physically transition is very much based on stuff that happened with intersex people. Like, for example, like the sex reassignment surgery procedures that we use now were actually invented on intersex infants. And the trans community does not seem to know that or talk about that. Like how basically the justification that was used, like the social justification that was used for SRS, so that trans people could have elective SRS, was basically saying that it was like a later version of the sex reassignment surgery that they do on intersex infants. So it's like the ethics of sex reassignment surgery as an elective procedure is based on the ethics of considering forced sex reassignment in babies to be ethical. And I'm not trying to conflate those two in the present sense. Obviously, one is awesome and like people's ability to do that if they choose to, and one is awful. But like the dyadic trans community kind of needs to know that like so much of the history and so much of like what they have access to now is tied into intersex stuff, and so like it's not some coincidence that there is all this conflation culturally between intersex things and trans things, because they are two groups of people whose interests are very mutually linked, you know what I mean? And so like I guess I just wish that people could pay more credit to that, and like and have more of an understanding of it when it comes to, you know, educating yourself and being sensitive towards issues, because I've had so many trans people say really like intersexist and like ignorant things to me since coming out as intersex, that like I'm just like, can you please inform yourself about some things. And yeah, so I mean, this is not at all to like rip on intersex dyadic people or anything like that, but I guess it's just more just like I don't want my identities to be at odds with each other, and I don't want like me to be expected by the community for the sake of like ideological purity to parse out my identities like that, especially when like there are two aspects of my identity that are both working towards the same end, like in so far as like like not to politicize my identities like purposefully, because obviously like the root of my identities is not political, but they are like inherently political in other ways, just in the ways that they force me to interact with certain institutions and power dynamics. Like I don't want to have to parse out two of my identities when they're both working towards when they both require the same things as far as accommodation in a lot of ways. And so the other thing is that basically like the reason why like binary transition is something that was like allowed within the like psychological or psychiatric community, and why that started becoming a thing when they started having like medical transition and things like that, was basically not even on the basis that the medical community believed in gender identity as an inherent thing, or that they believed that it was an immutable part of a person's personality, so much as it was seen that you could not stop a person from being gender nonconforming, from being a transvestite, and things like that. And so you would like allow this person to physically transition just basically for the sake of getting them out of public notice. Like, you know what I mean? Like it was almost an intentional there's almost like the medical community has always had this priority of like intentionally and systemically erasing androgynous and intersex people and non-binary, but non-binary people, but I mean like stopping people from looking physically androgynous, stopping people from looking visibly intersex, stopping people from having ambiguous gender identities such as non-binary. Like it was very much like, okay, well, if we absolutely cannot make you be your birth assigned gender, then we might as well just like get you as far over and close to being the other one, so at least you're something, and then like we're, you know, we don't have any nails sticking out, you know what I mean? And so like now I see all this like stuff about, I guess I'm pretty much just gonna I'm kind of gonna bleed into the other topic that I wanted to talk about, but I see all this stuff lately about how basically people are saying that like no, like because the trans community is so tied into feminism and women's rights and things like that. There's almost been this move that I've seen a little bit on Tumblr and spaces like that lately, that non-binary is basically like an incoherent social identity, that it doesn't mean anything, that like it, like, what am I trying to say? That it's like it doesn't place you anywhere on any sort of like privilege or oppression spectrum, as if that's even like a real like and good way to look at politics. And so that it's more politically correct for you to basically admit what you are and either like just identify as the gender that you actually live as, because all of us have a gender that we actually live as, like, you know what I mean? And either identify as cis or identifying as like binary trans. And I get that for a lot of people, non-binary is a transitional identity, and figuring out who they are, if whether they eventually decide that they want to live as a binary trans person or that they would be more comfortable living as their assigned gender. I get that it is that transitional identity for a lot of people, and I'm honestly totally fine with that. Like, I think that everyone, whether you're cis or transgender, like, has the right to experiment with their identity, and I'm not by any means trying to say that people don't have the right to use that identity as that kind of liminal space. But it very much is not that. It is not that for a lot of us. For a lot of us, like, non-binary kind of is the thing that we were always working towards. A lot of people have to go through a binary trans identity to realize that they're actually non-binary. A lot of people, like, for a lot of people, non-binary kind of is all there ever was and all there will be as far as their like gender identity goes. And they're never going to be able to like fit themselves into a category like that. But the thing that gets me is that like when I've been learning all this stuff about non-binary history and intersex history from some of the research that one of my partners been doing, I'm basically realizing that like yeah, the medical community has always had a vested interest in the elimination of androgynous, non-binary, and intersex people from public spaces, from public consciousness, from like visibility at all. And so much of the acceptance of binary trans people is actually based on the erasure of intersex and non-binary and androgynous people. And there is not really any credit paid to that, or any like integration of like any historical continuity of that, or any integration of that into current politics. Like, that very much is something that's just been kind of like swept under the rug. And so I feel like when people are criticizing non-binary identities, like it, like, I guess it just like really bugs me, because it's like you're like, I feel like a lot of the time people do not think of the intersection between non-binary and intersexuality. I feel like people do not like understand like the historical meaning behind choosing to be visibly androgynous, refusing a binary gender identity and stuff like that. And I feel like I guess like for me, like my identity is not political in cause, in nature, because I am just a non-binary person. I would just be a non-binary person, like regardless of what my situation was, because that is who I am. It's all I can be. Like, it's like I've tried living as a girl, it sucked. I tried living as a guy, it sucked. Like, I have too much gender and not enough gender to fit the whole of myself into one of those things. And I know that from trial and error, so this is just what I have to work with. And I guess like so the politicization of identities within the trans community and as imposed on the trans community from the outside kind of bothers me, because it's like the vast majority of us, I would say the vast majority of non-binary people, do not identify that way for political reasons. We identify that way because that is the way that we experience the world. We identify that way because that is our internal experience and the way that we relate to ourselves in the most authentic way. And I feel like politicizing it like that, like, what do you really live as, or what do you, like, you know what I mean, like, kind of like, what are you really by, like, X, Y, and Z category, very much, like, invalidates, like, because I know that I'm able to take up this space, that I'm able to, like, be open as a non-binary person in every aspect of my life and things like that, and that so much comes from my position of privilege, that I'm a white person, that I'm, you know, I am a physically disabled person, but it's an invisible disability, so to the average person, I'm a visibly able-bodied person. You know, I don't have any, like, developmental disabilities. I don't, like, I'm, you know, lower middle class, but I mean, like, I'm living in an apartment and things like that. Like, I have a lot of privilege in my life that I'm able to do this. And I feel like, and I kind of use that as, like, a vehicle for validating my identity, like, oh, like, obviously my identity is politically meaningful because this is what I live as, and this is, like, how I identify to everyone. But I realized recently that I guess it's kind of messed up for me to be like, oh, you can't say that non-binary is politically meaningless, because it is meaningful to me because I'm able to do these things because of my position of privilege, if that makes sense. But it also just kind of made me realize that it's messed up for people to say that you shouldn't identify a certain way because it doesn't have, like, a social, like, an established social role, because it's, like, basically that's saying that, like, my identity is more valid than someone who has the same identity as me, who's just not able to access being out, not able to access advocating for themselves, you know what I mean? And it applies to, like, all trans people. Like, there's tons of trans people who don't have access to doing the things that they would need to do to validate their identity, like, whether it be, like, clothing or transition or the ability to be out or things like that. And, like, their gender identities are obviously still valid, and we have to, like, for our own survival and for the sake of protecting each other, like, validate the identities of people who are not able to be out or express themselves as they would like to. So I feel like non-binary is, like, an inherently valid identity, and I feel like non-binary, well, again, like, for me, like, non-binary is not an identity that is political in cause. It is an identity that's kind of political in nature, in that, like, it is a politicized identity, as, like, via its interactions with different, like, power dynamics and institutions. And I think it's always been, like, an inherently radical thing to choose to present in an ambiguous gender presentation, to intentionally refuse classification, to refuse assimilation into a binary gender role. Like, I feel like non-binary identity and androgyny and being openly and visibly intersex have all been, like, inherently radical things, and inherently, like, big fuck yous to the medical industrial complex and to cissexism and transphobia and like dyadism and stuff like that, like, as a whole. And so I guess, like, I just wanted to go on this kind of mini rant that was about a bunch of different things, like, about, like, the interactions between the intersex community and the non-binary and trans communities, and, like, this, like, thing that's been happening recently with, like, trying to say that people shouldn't identify as non-binary because it's not specific enough or something, and then, like, how, like, non-binary identity and choosing to be gender ambiguous and things like that are, like, incredibly powerful and incredibly, like, politically meaningful things that I want to show some love for. And anyone who feels safe and comfortable doing that, and even if you don't, like, you are still just as valid as everyone else. So yeah, I'm kind of rambling off now, but I guess that was some thoughts that I had and things that I wanted to talk about, and I hope that any of that made sense. I hope you have a lovely day, and I will see you next time. Peace out.